The U.S. Supreme Court has ruled that race can no longer be taken into account in university admissions. The decision overturns decades-old policies regarding affirmative action in higher education. Here's what that means for hundreds of thousands of Americans. Also known as positive discrimination, affirmative action first came about in the US in the 1960s as a way to mitigate discrimination for minority races and ethnic groups. Against the backdrop of the civil rights movement, President John F. Kennedy issued an executive order in 1961 mandating affirmative action to prevent racial bias in employment practices. A few years later, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed another order banning discrimination in various situations, including schools and government services. Two cases involving admissions at Harvard University and the University of North Carolina were brought before the Supreme Court in October 2022 by a group called Students for Fair Admissions. The nonprofit group, which was formed by conservative activist Edward Bloom, first filed lawsuits against both schools in 2014. It argued that Harvard's admissions policy related to race infringed the Equal Protection Clause in the U.S. Constitution, which prohibits discrimination based on race, color, or national origin. The group called for the overturning of earlier Supreme Court decisions that maintained otherwise. The court's conservative majority was inclined to agree with the plaintiff, ruling 6-3 against UNC and 6-2 against Harvard.
These opinions reestablish the founding principles of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which clearly forbids treating Americans differently by race.
There are concerns that the end of race-conscious admissions will affect the future college admissions of certain demographics and underrepresented groups as well as enrollment procedures across the U.S., especially in Ivy League universities. Harvard has said it will comply with the court decision, but that does not change its values.
The Supreme Court's decision on college and university admissions will change how we pursue the educational benefits of diversity, but our commitment to that work remains steadfast.
Already, bans on race-based college admissions are in effect in 9 U.S. states. Those are Arizona, California, Florida, Idaho, Oklahoma, New Hampshire, Michigan, Nebraska, and Washington. Experts say previous bans saw a drop in enrollments from minority races that were later partially recovered. In 1996, when California banned affirmative action, enrollments at Berkeley and the University of California fell 40% among Black and Hispanic students. To create a diverse student body following the ban, UCLA has invested millions of dollars in outreach programs and in diversifying their student body. A recently released Pew Research Center survey found that half of Americans disapprove of considerations of applicants' race, while a third approve. President Biden has said he strongly disagrees with the court's decision.
Discrimination still exists in America. Today's decision does not change that. It's a simple fact.
Former President Donald Trump welcomed the move, vowing to remove all diversity programs if re-elected.
To vigorously enforce yesterday's Supreme Court ruling, I will eliminate all diversity, equity, and inclusion programs across the entire federal government.
Former President Barack Obama said affirmative action gave a chance to generations of students who had been systematically excluded from most of America's key institutions. Critics have argued that legacy applications across elite U.S. colleges and universities are also discriminatory. On July 3rd, 3 civil rights groups lodged a complaint against Harvard, alleging that its existing policy for undergraduate applicants with family ties to the institution disproportionately benefits white students. Although the Supreme Court reversed an almost 40-year precedent, it still gave some allowances for college and university admissions staff to consider race in admissions essays. President Biden has urged colleges to consider hurdles prospective students may face.
If a student had to overcome adversity on their path to education, the college should recognize and value that.
Affirmative action remains a key point of contention in American education. Universities and colleges are looking to get a better understanding of the court's decision in relation to future admissions policies. They will now have to find alternative ways to ensure their student bodies are diverse.
The Supreme Court has just made our fight for racial equality that much harder.
For Black Americans, the quest for equity and justice has been an exhausting and unending journey. Time and again, we have witnessed policies and programs that appear to offer support and opportunity, only to find that they do not adequately address the historical and systemic injustices we face. One of the most prominent examples of this is affirmative action, a policy often touted as a tool for leveling the playing field in education and employment. Yet, as we peel back the layers of its creation and implementation, it becomes glaringly clear that affirmative action was not specifically designed to redress the unique historical injustices faced by Black people. Instead, it has often served as a political workaround for institutions and a smokescreen for deeper systemic inequities, leaving us grappling with the stark realities of ongoing oppression. Affirmative action emerged in the 1960s, a time of significant civil rights struggle. The intent behind these policies was to combat pervasive discrimination and to create opportunities for those who had been systematically excluded from the American dream. However, it is crucial to understand that affirmative action was born out of a complex interplay of political pressure and social dynamics. The policies were crafted not only to benefit Black people, but also to appease a wider array of disadvantaged groups, including women, veterans, and the economically disadvantaged. While the inclusion of these groups has value, it is troubling that the specific and historical plight of Black Americans has not been prioritized in the broader conversation about affirmative action. In practice, affirmative action policies often navigated around issues of race, creating an illusion of progress without substantial change. For many institutions, it became a convenient way to signal their commitment to diversity without addressing the root causes of racial inequality. As Black individuals sought better representation in educational institutions and workplaces, we found ourselves squeezed into a system that, while offering a seat at the table, still left the table predominantly white and privileged. This was not the radical overhaul needed to dismantle centuries of oppression. It was a patchwork solution that ultimately failed to deliver true equity. When we consider the dismantling of affirmative action policies in recent years, we must reflect on what this means for us as a community. The Supreme Court has made rulings that have severely restricted the mechanisms by which institutions can consider race in admissions and hiring processes. The gutting of affirmative action is a reflection of a broader societal backlash against the very concept of equity. Some argue that such policies perpetuate a culture of victimhood and entitlement, neglecting to recognize that these discussions are not about entitlement, but rather the necessary reclamation of agency and opportunity that has been historically denied to us. The most disheartening aspect of this ongoing struggle is the glaring absence of reparations. While affirmative action has been reduced and undercut, the conversation about reparations, a critical acknowledgement of the harm done and the debt owed to Black Americans, remains largely marginalized. For centuries, our ancestors endured the brutalities of slavery, followed by the oppressive systems of segregation and discrimination. Throughout this history, Black Americans were stripped of land, wealth, and opportunities to build prosperity. Today, we continue to face the cascading effects of these injustices, which manifest in economic disparities, limited access to quality education, and systemic racism that permeates every aspect of our lives. Reparations would seek to address these historical injustices and provide a pathway to real economic empowerment. They would not only serve as a financial restitution, but also acknowledge the ongoing trauma and economic disparity that Black Americans face as a direct result of centuries of systemic oppression. Yet, the conversation continues to stall. Politicians are quick to dismiss the notion as impractical or divisive, while simultaneously embracing superficial diversity initiatives that fail to bring about substantive change. The dismissal of affirmative action and the refusal to seriously entertain reparations encapsulate a broader societal refusal to confront the deep-rooted racism that still permeates our institutions. When affirmative action was dismantled, it was framed as a move toward fairness, an attempt to achieve true meritocracy. But in reality, this was a retreat from recognition of the systemic barriers that continue to disenfranchise us. The message was clear. In the pursuit of equality, the mechanisms that could help rectify our historical and ongoing struggles were deemed too controversial or unpopular to sustain. As we navigate this current landscape, it is imperative for us to push back against the narratives that seek to undermine our fight for justice. We must reclaim the conversation around affirmative action, acknowledging that its initial intentions may have been noble, but its execution has often fallen short. We have a responsibility to demand policies that are explicitly designed to uplift our community, not as an afterthought, but as a fundamental recognition of our rights as citizens who have been historically marginalized. We must amplify the call for reparations with urgency and tenacity. The systematic theft of our labor, culture, and potential cannot be overlooked or forgotten. The fight for reparations is not merely about compensation. It's about systemic change and recognition. It's about ensuring that future generations of Black Americans do not continue to bear the burdens of an unjust system that has repeatedly failed to recognize their humanity. Let us be clear-eyed about the path ahead. Affirmative action was never our deliverance. Instead, it served as a temporary measure, a distraction from the real work needed to dismantle systemic inequality. As we continue our struggle, let us focus on demanding comprehensive reparative justice and advocate for policies that recognize our unique history and ongoing challenges. We must unite to confront the systemic racism that persists, asserting our rightful place as equals in this society. The road ahead may be long and fraught with resistance, but we owe it to ourselves and our ancestors to keep fighting for true justice and equity, one that transcends temporary solutions and addresses the core issues of inequality that have haunted our communities for far too long.